Genetically modified foods bring more harm than good because of its historical background and effects on the world, issues and drawbacks, and ecological impact they cause. The risks of GMOs in foods outweigh the alleged benefits, and therefore they should not be implemented into our daily meals.
Hi, this is Gwenwu, and before going over how the risks of GMO foods outweigh the benefits that they are claimed to provide, I will first go over some background information on GMO foods. So for starters, GMO stands for Genetically Modified Organisms, which means that GMO foods and crops are basically food that is genetically engineered and modified for specific purposes. This may or may not come as a surprise, but GMO foods have been around since 1973 when Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohen created the first GMO food. One last piece of background information is that since GMO foods have been created, they have become much more common, and now, shockingly, they are pretty much found in every grocery store in the United States. It's Gwen Wu again, and I will be going over the effects that GMO foods have on the world economically, socially, culturally, and environmentally. To begin with, GMO foods have an epic effect economically and financially. After conducting research, I found that GMO crops can cost tens, hundreds, and even millions of dollars to produce and take a very long time to be developed and marketed. And when I say a long time, I mean over a decade. For example, on average, it takes about 13 years and $130 million for GMOs to be produced and marketed, in other words, created and shelved in stores. Regarding the economical effect GMOs have on the world, their environmental effect is even larger. Reason for this is because growing GMO crops can have a negative impact on soil and water ecosystems. However, that's only a small part of their environmental influence. Believe it or not, other species like birds and insects habitats have been destroyed because of the production of GMO foods. This greatly affects the world's biodiversity. A tragic instance of this is when the production of genetically modified herbicide-tolerant corn and soy, aka twin herbicides, demolished much of the monarch butterfly habitat in North America while also creating a large spread of weeds. This next effect has an impact on the world, both socially and environmentally, as it affects humans and wildlife. This effect is that GMO crop production has greatly increased the usage of glyphosate by around 16 times the amount that was used for non-GMO foods. Glyphosate is bad and toxic towards the environment as it destroys many of wildlife's habitats, just like the monarch butterflies' habitats were destroyed. But it's very harmful and toxic towards humans because it has been known to cause blood cancer. Last but not least, the cultural and social effect in which GMOs provide is that the belief that they're very unethical. They are believed to be unethical since they're far from traditional farming, and they're also made with unnatural technology, making the GMO foods themselves unnatural. This affects many cultures, especially ones that are big on agriculture, and it affects society because it greatly changes the way society views farming and their perspective on new technologies. Overall, these are my main points on how GMOs affect the world.
With genetically modified organisms come many problems, one of the biggest being contamination. When GM crops are pollinated, the pollen can drift into other fields or even into the wild. This contaminates other crops that were not meant to be GMOs and can be extremely harmful to the environment. There's only one solution to this, and it is ending GM food permanently, since there is no way to prevent pollination. Contamination ultimately causes farmers to lose a lot of money due to rejection from food exports where GM foods are banned because of something they cannot control. Additionally, organic farmers can lose their certification and their premium they get from selling organic crops. Another huge issue is uncontrollable weeds and insects. When farmers genetically modify their crops, or when their crops are contaminated, it makes their plants grow larger and faster, therefore they face relentless insects and pests. The only solutions are either using older and more toxic chemicals, such as Roundup, to keep them away, or keeping them away manually making the farmers work even harder. And although there are many issues that come along with GMOs, pleiotropy that is unable to be detected using GMO regulation tests is the next one. The tests that are done to make sure GMOs are within regulation overlook many issues with GM foods that are not easily found, such as issues within the cell structure which ultimately lead to new unexpected DNA. GMO regulations need to be updated because when the DNA is altered, it can affect the cell's relationship with other cells.
Ms. Colson, I'll be explaining the cons of the ecological cons of genetically modified food. So, the first con that comes with genetically modified food is outcrossing. And so, outcrossing refers to the risk of genes mixing with those of conventional crops that's used in rice, bread, etc. And so, the problem with this is that it could actually potentially lead to new development of cancer or allergies inside someone's body, as there's a risk of genetic mutation within the genetically modified food. And so the second con is antibacterial resistance. And so a problem arises concerning the genetic modification of food, and these foods, which can actually boost a crop's resistance to disease or tolerance to herbicides, can actually affect a person's ability to fight against illnesses. So what happens is that there's a small chance that the genes in food can transfer to the cells or bacteria of your gut, which leads to the gene being passed on to the person consuming the food. And so this is a problem, as a resistance to antibiotics could lead to an increased risk of disease or illness, as well as making the threat of said illness much more severe. Even though the chance is low, it's still something that could potentially be pretty dangerous. And so the third con is environmental damage. By growing plants or raising livestock in conditions that wouldn't normally support them, there's the possibility of critically damaging that environment. And so one example of this is crossbreeding. For example, let's take weeds that may accidentally be crossed with GMO plants. Those weeds can often become resistant to herbicides, defeating the whole purpose of genetically modified plants or crops. As a result, more efforts will be needed to fix the issue. Unless a better solution is proposed, this will inevitably continue happening, leading to a never-ending cycle of resistant weeds and new solutions being needed. So one point the opposition may make in support of genetically modified food is they might say GMOs can increase nutrients in foods and save lives. However, only 50 grams of the most popular genetically modified food, aka golden rice, can provide 60% of the recommended daily intake of vitamin A, opposed to 50 grams of white or normal rice, that can provide 100% of the recommended daily intake of vitamin A. Thank you.
The other side may argue that GM foods are just as safe as regularly grown crops because no adverse health effects attributed to genetically engineered crops have been documented in the human population, and about 70 to 80% of foods already contain genetically modified ingredients, so there's no reason to fear them if we have already been eating them. However, according to Nothing to Sneeze At, The Allergenicity of GMOs, by a PhD candidate at Harvard University, a woman named Grace Booth went into anaphylactic shock because starling corn had, quote, entered the human supply due to cross-pollination when the GMO corn was planted too close to unmodified crops, end quote. GM foods unapproved for human consumption can cross-pollinate and get mixed into foods approved for eating, which can risk allergic reactions and other dangers to the body. While farmers can attempt to prevent this from happening by using buffer zones, not all farmers will follow those guidelines, and pollen can still travel unexpectedly long distances via bees and other pollinators, ultimately making this phenomenon unpreventable.
I will be presenting our group's third counter-argument. A supporter of GMO foods may say that GMOs can save us from a chocolate shortage. This is because cacao plants are very susceptible to disease such as witch's broom, and loss of cacao plants causes cacao farmers to lose an annual $750 million. CCN51 was developed to be resistant to diseases. Another reason why GMOs may possibly save us from a chocolate shortage is that cacao trees grow painfully slow and it can take 5 years to grow a single fruit. CCN 51 can produce 4 to 10 times the yield of a regular cacao tree. As a nemesis of GMO foods, although these facts may be true, despite the expected benefits, seeds from the CCN 51 tree taste lousy and flat compared to regular cacao seeds, especially if the cacao is not specified whether it was genetically modified. Chocolate artisan and candy manufacturers' products will suffer due to the bland-tasted chocolate. This leads to a huge problem involving company sales and customer dissatisfaction.
It is evident that GMO foods cause much more harm than good. Due to the extreme amounts of money and time necessary for developing GMOs and the hazards to human health, faults that bring its downfall, and the dangerous amounts of ecological damage, the uncountable amount of flaws lead to the downfall of genetically modifying crops. All of the evidence clearly adds up and justifies how dabbling with nature's blueprints is dangerous to society and the health of all. Ladies and gentlemen, for the sake of our children and environment, we urge every one of you to end the use of genetic engineering in our crops and produce.